Yeah, but the problem is, I must say, for me, it was quite frustrating because we're not able, and I said it to Campo, I said it to everybody 100 times, if we're not able to discuss really, we sit down to discuss 1, 2, 3 days, something, some really fundamental things.
So kindly pass the water.
Not a bit put together.
Yes. Thanks.
Still.
I have a glass.
This is for Mark.
Oh. You're welcome.
It may not be enough to get together.
I know, we're getting a second one.
The coherence panel now
Thanks.
has will appoint him
Can I pour your water?
if he survives the
Don't take it all.
of the UN system.
Okay, that's all you want?
Looking for other kind
Oh, I can see what you mean.
Implications of that are
There's much here.
Nobody knows.
Well, if you want to have some melted ice cubes in a while.
The key lights are probably not.
Do we start? Okay. I think we'll start now. Good afternoon. My name is Bhumika Muchala, and welcome to this Wilson Center event on the Policy Space Debate. We have an exciting lineup of panelists today, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the 3 Wilson Center programs who have co-sponsored this event with the Asia program: the Latin American program, the Brazil project, and the Science, Technology in America and the Global Economy program. I would also like to thank the following individuals and organizations for their support: John Sewell, Joe Marie Greasegrabber, and the New Rules for Global Finance Coalition, the United Nations Association of the Capital Area, and the Center for Economic and Policy Research. The objective of this forum today is to address an important discussion in the international political economy of development, that of national policy space, and whether the rules and conditions in a globalized and multilateral economy help or hinder the development process. The debate centers on the economic policy conditions attached to the programs of international financial institutions, such as financial liberalization and privatization, and the rules of both multi and bilateral trade agreements, including intellectual property rights and the liberalization in trade, investments, and services. Developing countries stress that the crucial importance of policy autonomy to be able to choose a diversity of approaches rather than a one-size-fits-all approach is necessary for economic growth and development. Recently, several events have increased the international attention on policy space. The 2006 report of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development contends that globalization intensifies the impact of external influences over national development. The report recommends a fair balance between policy autonomy and development. Several developing countries are also in the process of obtaining debt reliefs, which presents opportunities to craft alternative macroeconomic policies that are more in line with their own development goals. Furthermore, since the Asian financial crisis, many East Asian countries are building up their currency reserves in order to indemnify themselves from external borrowing. Today, the advent of China's role as a creditor and investor for lesser developed countries poses new implications for developmental policies at the national level. It is in this context of change that an analysis of the nexus between national policy space, development, and international financial institutions is critical. Casting light on these vital intersections can provide more clarity and depth to the dynamics of economic development in developing countries. Stakeholders from both developed and developing countries, the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, and global civil society all have a role to play in the evolving public discussions on this issue. And on this note, I will introduce our keynote speaker, Jomo K.S., who is the Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Previously, he was a professor in the Applied Economics Department in the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He is the chair of the International Development Economics Associates and was a founder and director of the Institute of Social Analysis in Malaysia. Some of his most recent publications include The New Development Economics After the Washington Consensus, Malaysia's Political Economy and Tigers in Trouble, Rent-Seeking and Economic Development. He will speak today on overcoming constraints to pursuing national development strategies within the context of world inequality.
Thank you very much, Bhumika, for those very kind words of introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I want to thank the Wilson Center, John Sewell, and others involved in arranging this program. And and to also thank the other panelists for being here. It's a panelist of a lot of old and new friends, and so I feel in very good company today. Although I hope that will not stifle the debate on what is obviously a very, very important issue. What I would like to address today is the whole question of policy space, and much of this is animated by, as Bhumika pointed out, a number of recent developments. I would particularly underscore the significance of the UNCTAD 11, the meeting in Sao Paulo in the year 2004, where the international community made a very strong recognition of the importance of policy space in realizing the development aspirations of the international community, particularly developing countries. More recently, last year at the World Summit in September, the international community once again reaffirmed this commitment by making a commitment for countries to develop their own national development strategies, and this would obviously underscore the whole question of national ownership on the one hand, and the problems associated with existing policies, policy prescriptions, packages, and so on, particularly those associated with what are called poverty reduction strategies. So it is with this background in mind that I think we addressed this debate. And as many of you know, 3 weeks ago, the World Bank Independent Evaluation Department came out with a report basically underscoring the developments on the question of conditionality. And the most important findings from the purposes of our discussion are the following. Firstly, that there has been a nominal decrease in the number of conditionalities imposed in recent years, but this has been exaggerated by three factors. Number one, there has been, by using the mid-1990s as the base year, rather than the more recent period, the decline seems greater than it actually is. Secondly, and very importantly, there is the question of bunching. A number of conditionalities are packaged as one condition, and this obviously means that while there's a superficial or nominal decline in the number of conditionalities, in effect, the number of real conditionalities may not necessarily go down because of the bunching, consequences of bunching. And thirdly, and not least importantly, there has been a very important resurgence or emphasis rather on what is called benchmarking. So while you do not have as many conditionalities, benchmarks, which are meant to be, which are very important in signaling devices in terms of disciplining governments, serve pretty much the same effect. They serve pretty much the effect of conditionalities. Now, I'd like to start off with a graph here. This graph basically indicates what has been happening with development in the second half of the 20th century. And as you can see, national income per capita in developing countries has generally declined in all regions of the world except Asia. And if you take out the China effect from Asia, you'll probably find that Asia too has probably declined relative to developed countries. The most precipitous collapses have, of course, been what is well known has been the effects in Africa, which suffered a long-term decline for the last quarter of the 20th century. But it should also be underscored that in recent years, many countries in Africa have actually done reasonably well. And in fact, this is part of a larger trend of developing countries generally doing quite well in the last 5 years. But this has got very little to do with the policies which have been imposed, but has got much more to do with the fact that developing countries have been able to take advantage of the higher commodity prices, just as was the case in the second half of the 1970s. What noteworthy here, of course, is the collapse of Eastern Europe in the last decade of the 20th century, and this is something which is often not not commented on, and so we find that average income in Eastern Europe is actually quite comparable to Latin America. And if much of Eastern Europe now qualifies to be part of the European Union and perhaps soon after of the OECD, one begins to wonder what becomes the criterion for membership of the OECD, and that in turn raises a number of interesting questions, which I won't get into at this point. What is left out of this graph, of course, is the fact that much of Latin America actually grew quite rapidly for a period, particularly before the Second World War. And the chair referred to the fact that the Brazil project is involved in sponsoring this event, and it's noteworthy that until the 1970s, Brazil had one of the highest growth rates for half a century, one of the highest growth rates in the world. And so, we're not talking about a situation where developing countries have not been able to grow. Many of you know, for example, about how significant Argentina was at the turn of the last century, thanks to filmmakers, you are reminded about the Manaus Opera House in the middle of the rainforest during the time of the rubber boom, when the automobile was becoming popular, and so on and so forth. So it's very important to get a sense that it's not as if all countries have been doing very, very badly. All countries are coming out from as Joseph Conrad would have it, out of darkness. And we are really talking about a very, very rich and varied and complex range of experiences. The second graph I thought is a rather interesting graph, which I wanted to share with you. It's the axis, the bottom axis. This is an attempt at three-dimensional representation of income distribution in the world. And the bottom axis is actually of income groups, with the rich on the left and the poor on the right. And the diagonal on towards your right is actually an attempt to capture the variation among countries, with richer countries further away and poorer countries here. So in the bottom, in the front corner, you will find the poorest people in the poorest countries. And the skyscraper right at the back refers to the richer people in the richer countries. And as you know, the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economic Research recently published a report co-authored by Tony Shorrocks, Ed Wolf, and a couple of other people, which basically shows that about 2% of the world's population owns about 50% of the household wealth in the world. So this simply confirms the relationship between the maldistribution of income and the maldistribution of wealth. Now, I put this graph up for your attention mainly to underscore the significance of China. The point I made earlier, that once you take away China, and you actually have a very different situation in terms of world income inequality. That China, the rapid growth of China especially during the recent period, has significantly affected world distribution of income, especially this graph underscores this. Now, these other graphs basically underscore it gives you an indication what the situation was like 4.5 decades ago at the beginning of the 1960s, the kinds of contrasts in income per capita of the poorest quintile of countries, the poorest 20% of countries. You had an average of $212 per capita income, and this went up by about a quarter over 4 decades to 267. For the richest 20 countries, it went up from 11,000 to 32,000. Now, this graph, basically shows you what the kinds of inequalities in expenditure, in private consumption, in household spending, in a number of different areas, which I won't elaborate on at this point. Now, what we also find, and this has been observed by a number of other commentators as well, has been that growth has been slower in the recent period, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, compared to the 60s and the 70s. The period often associated with what Keynesians refer to as the golden age, and welfare improvements have also been more modest since the 1980s for another reason, and that is the reduced role, the reduced fiscal capacities of governments in providing for welfare. And so poverty reduction has been slower, not only due to less growth, but due to worsening income distribution. These bar charts basically indicate how the slower growth in the recent period has affected different income groups, and generally most income groups have fared much less well in the 80s and 90s compared to the 60s and 70s. Now, the basic argument we would make is that this slower growth has been due principally to reforms which have been associated with what has been called structural adjustment. Structural adjustment refers to a number of reforms which were required often by the Bretton Woods institutions, but also by other international financial institutions, as a condition for access to loans. And these loans, I'm going to identify about 10 of these kinds of policies, but I will focus my discussion after this on 3, which I would suggest have been very influential and important in terms of reducing the policy space for developing countries. Trade liberalization, financial liberalization. There has also been a number of other factors which have contributed to what we would term contractionary macroeconomic influences. Generally, finance ministers and central bank governors find themselves increasingly subject to signals which are sent by the market, and there is a strong propensity to against consumer price inflation, and this results in macroeconomic policies which tend to be subjected to contractionary influences. There's also a tendency, because of this greater market influence, to adopt macroeconomic policies which tend to be much more pro-cyclical than in the past. Other important factors have been the trend towards privatization, particularly during the 1990s, although interestingly you find that the World Bank has since recanted. And in fact, recently I got a letter from a professor of economics in London who wrote back to me and said the World Bank now condemns privatization. Well, I'm not quite sure the World Bank condemns privatization, but one researcher associated with the bank certainly has been quite critical about the consequences of privatization. Other factors which are important for our purposes is the significance of strengthened intellectual property rights. Many of us now think of strengthened intellectual property rights as a sort of a fact of life. But I would remind you that the strengthening of intellectual property rights, at least internationally, is of fairly recent origin and can be dated back to the second Reagan administration, when Secretary of State Schultz played a very important role in ensuring that countries, at that time, of course, the Cold War was still significant, that friendly countries enforced intellectual property rights, and subsequently this was incorporated as part of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, and then became part of the WTO framework, which is now very important in terms of shaping the policy space which exists, particularly for developing countries. 2 or 3 other factors which are important for us to consider. I've already mentioned the significance of loan policy conditionalities. There's also a great deal of rhetoric and a great deal of concern about improving governance. Good governance is something which I'm sure is like motherhood and apple pie. Nobody really objects to good governance, but what it often means is often fairly subjective, even whimsical. And I might add that as a number of statistical studies have pointed out, there has been no demonstrable relationship between good governance and economic growth, even if you lag if you build in certain lags into any kind of statistical analysis, you cannot find a rigorous relationship between good governance indicators and economic growth. Whether you use the CPIA indicators, which are the current favorite in this town, or some of the other indicators which are available. If for those of you who are interested in the subject, there's a particularly interesting paper by Mushtaq Khan, with whom I've collaborated with, available on the G24 website. The other factor, of course, is the changing nature of global economic governance. You're all very familiar with the Washington-based institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, but I would also add the new role, the role of the new WTO. Because the World Trade Organization is not simply a new name for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, but rather has created new regimes of discipline, which have been extremely important in terms of constraining the policy space. Now let me focus on three areas: trade, finance, and lastly, fiscal issues. Let me begin with the whole question of trade. I think it's now generally accepted that the terms of trade have basically moved against developing countries in at least three ways. And one, of course, is the relationship of the prices of primary commodities against manufacturers. This was established in the United Nations half a century ago by the late Hans Singer, who passed away earlier this year, together with Raúl Prebisch, the distinguished Argentine economist who was the first Secretary General of UNCTAD. Represented here by Mr. Flassbeck, and this was and their finding has been supported by subsequent work, most significantly the work of Grilli and Young for the IMF, and Ocampo and Parra from my own institution, and basically they demonstrate, and I will show you a graph. Yes, this basically shows you that that has been a downward trend in commodity prices over the course of the 20th century, and episodically this has been most sharp around 1920, and again during the 1980s after the oil and commodity price booms of the 1970s. Now, second very important development, which is important for us to recognize here, is the decline in terms of trade of tropical agricultural products compared with temperate agricultural products. This was a relationship which Arthur Lewis, the late West Indian economist, drew attention to in the 1950s, and although it has not been corroborated by subsequent research across the board, if you look at trends for particular commodities, this basically is borne out. If you compare, for example, what has happened to the price of, let us say, cotton compared to the price of wool, as comparators. The third and more recent development is the relationship between the prices of manufactured goods from developing countries compared to developed countries. And what you find here is that developing countries, and that at least for the last 2 decades of the 20th century, there has been a decline in the prices of manufactures from developing countries compared to developed countries. And there is no easy explanation for this. I mean, the debate is still, the jury is still out. There's no settled understanding of this. But I would suggest that it might have something to do with the fact that developing countries generally start producing goods where there are no strong barriers to entry into those industries. And here we are, of course, talking about generic manufacturers. Textiles and so on and so forth, or for that matter, DRAMs. Okay, whereas other types of products where there are strong intellectual property rights, those constitute monopolistic barriers to entry, where market power is in the hands of the corporations, and hence they are able to charge much more for the manufactures which they produce and they sell, and hence we find that there's no corresponding downward pressure through competition on the prices, and as a consequence, the terms of trade between manufacturers from developing countries have also declined compared to those from developed countries. Now, the consequence of all this is what the Jagdish Bhagwati, who is a great advocate of trade liberalization, once described in an article more than 40 years ago as immiserizing growth. Okay, so this is something which I think which has not come back into the debate recently, although Jagdish Bhagwati continues to be very influential in this regard. Now, other factors which are extremely important is there is very grudging recognition about the importance of trade policy for industrialization. But I would point out that due to the structural reforms and trade liberalization which has been undertaken over more than 2 decades now, we have seen a significant collapse of manufacturing capacity in developing countries. This has been largely associated with import substituting industrialization. Many of the infant industries did not grow up to become competitive, internationally competitive, and this is widely acknowledged. And this was probably worse felt in African countries, because it was in African countries, generally speaking, got independence much later than Asian countries. And of course, Asian countries generally got independence much later than Latin American countries. And so the African countries had much less time to develop their industries, and the industries were therefore much more vulnerable when trade liberalization was basically imposed, and many of these industries collapsed. Export-oriented industrialization seems to have generally been much more successful, but one should also note that many export-oriented industries have also collapsed when they have been subjected to the full forces of trade liberalization. Witness, for example, what happened has happened since the beginning of last year. In the course of the last 23 or 24 months, millions of jobs have been lost. Mainly women's jobs have been lost because of trade liberalization. The end of the agreement on textiles and clothing, which succeeded the previous agreement, multi-fiber arrangement, which basically provided opportunities for latecomer developing countries to begin industrialization through garments production. Now that has basically collapsed, and of course many of the people affected have been women. Now this is also true of some of the electronics industry which has developed in certain parts of the world which are no longer competitive with the advent of China, and so on and so forth. Now the third element to recognize here is the significance of the judicious use of trade policy for the purposes of development. And I would like to emphasize that in Northeast Asia, in the post-war period, as in many other parts of the world before that, effective protection conditional on export promotion has been crucial to beginning industrialization. Basically, countries the Northeast Asian countries basically protected industries and firms from the full consequences of trade competition, but on condition that they export within a relatively short period of time, and by requiring them to export, they became cost competitive as well as quality competitive. Their products became acceptable in foreign markets, and so on and so forth. So this device, which is only possible through the use of trade policy, was crucial for developing countries to be able to catch up. Now, if you think about the consequences of this of an earlier period, if you think, for example, about the writings of Frederick List basically developed his ideas after visiting this country. He actually wrote quite a number of things before coming to this country. He actually wrote a book, Heiner can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was called The Principles of Natural Economy. And then he came here, he discovered the work of Alexander Hamilton, and then wrote another book called The Principles of the National Economy. And that became the basis, and it's often regarded as the contemporary basis for import substitution, in substituting industrialization, and so on and so forth. But in effect, it was because of his recognition of the earlier work of Hamilton and Hamilton's contribution in his report on manufactures about the significance of protection. And if you think about the American War of National Independence, I mean, since we are here in a building which in a sense celebrates some of this, if you think of the War of National Independence, it begins with the ultimate defiant act of protectionism, the Boston Tea Party, and if you think of the likely consequences of a different outcome of the Civil War, if the South had won the Civil War, I think you can expect the economic structure of the contemporary United States to be closer to that of Australia or New Zealand, where there are 40 million sheep and 3 million people, than the kind of economic structure which you currently have in the United States. So the significance of this kind of policy space cannot be underestimated. And I remember in one of my earlier trips to Washington, visiting the Smithsonian. In the old days, the Wilson Center was in the Smithsonian complex, in the castle, I think it was called. And I remember visiting the Museum of American History, and there's a panel which talks about the American participation in the First World's Fair at Crystal Palace, and discovering how backward American technology was at that time, despite Jefferson's contribution to the Springfield rifle and all that, and the determined effort at trying to advance American technology and American industry in the second half of the 19th century as a consequence of this recognition of its own technological backwardness at that time. Now, one of the desirable consequences of this recent debate on aid for trade, which has been going on in Geneva and beyond, has been a recognition about its consequences for developing countries. In terms of fiscal space, aid for trade now recognizes that developing countries which have been forced to pursue trade liberalization have basically lost a great deal of tariff revenue. And for countries with very limited taxation capacity, this loss of tariff revenue is extremely important. In some of the poorest countries, tariff revenue accounts for almost half of total tax revenue. So removing tariff revenue basically means reducing this fiscal space tremendously. The loss of production and export capacities is also another consequence of trade liberalization, which is now grudgingly being recognized. And the very difficult task and cost and high cost of building new internationally competitive, productive and export capacities and capabilities is also now being recognized through the aid for trade debate. Whether or not the aid for trade will actually in any way match all these costs and losses remains to be seen. And in fact, so far the indications are that aid for trade will simply be diversionary from existing aid. Some of it will be specifically channeled and earmarked for trade purposes. Now, let me move very quickly now to talking about another area, and that is the whole area of finance. As you know, there has been a significant shift in the international debate on financial liberalization in recent years, especially following the Asian crisis. But let me go back and refresh your memories about what the advocates for international financial liberalization, or what is now termed financial globalization, used to say. They used to say that by opening up these barriers between countries, you would have a flow of funds from the capital rich to the capital poor. This really has not materialized. In fact, there has been a flow of funds in the opposite direction. And as Ken Rogoff, who used to be the economic counselor for the IMF, commented at the United Nations last month, the United States now has the single largest foreign aid program as a recipient. And this, I think, is not without significance. The flow of funds has actually been from the south, even from relatively poor continents such as Africa to the north, rather than the converse. Now, secondly, the cost of funds have not really gone down, contrary to the claims. There have been exceptional periods, and the recent period when U.S. interest rates were very, very low for a number of reasons was one of those periods. But generally speaking, the cost of funds have not been lower. And thirdly, and I think not insignificantly, many of the old sources of volatility and instability have undoubtedly been reduced. Now it is possible to hedge against exchange rate losses or interest rate losses. But new sources of volatility and instability have been introduced by the proliferation of financial instruments, often referred to as financial deepening. Now, other effects of financial deepening, financial liberalization, which I will mention, which constrain the space from a financial point of view, which include the following. There is now, for a number of reasons, some of which I alluded to earlier, there are many more pressures now on developing countries, especially on their finance ministers, to adopt policies which are counter-inflationary. And these counter-inflationary policies often have a deflationary effect on economic growth. A second factor, which is very important, of course, is that financial liberalization often means the obliteration of institutions as well as instruments which have been developmental in purpose. You look at the demise of what are called national development banks, for instance, in many countries. A third factor, of course, is that being much more subject to market forces, the ability of central banks and finance ministries to adopt and develop counter-cyclical instruments and institutions has again also been constrained. And so the ability to respond, for example, to pressures in financial markets or commodity price collapses has been much more constrained as a consequence. And fourthly, what this earlier this week, as you know, Yunus received the Nobel laureate for peace for his work in the Grameen Bank, which was a very important initiative to try to develop what might be termed inclusive finance, making available credit facilities to groups which would not normally have access to such credit facilities. Now, the possibility of doing that kind of work, of including much more people, of making sure that credit facilities are available to much more people, is of course significantly constrained by financial liberalization. Now, all this, of course, basically has very significant consequences. Trade instruments and financial instruments have been a very important part of the development story of much of the world. Other factors, of course, have included human resource development and, of course, policies involving technology and so on. And I do not have time to go into all that right now. I'm sure my colleagues will be talking about it. Let me move into the last area, which I'll elaborate on to some extent, and that's the whole area of macroeconomic policy. I have already made several allusions to the fact that macroeconomic policy is far more constrained. There's tendency that there's much more pro-cyclical than ever before, reflecting the volatility of financial markets and commodity prices, and the ability to stimulate and stabilize developing country growth and to reduce global inequality really requires much more counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy space, as I've suggested earlier. The objectives of macroeconomic policy should take a broader view of what might be called macroeconomic stabilization. There's a tendency in the recent discussion to focus on one aspect of macroeconomic stabilization, and that is consumer price stabilization. And this is reflected, for example, by what is called inflation targeting and other kinds of policy fetishes. Now, a much broader view would emphasize the need for macroeconomic stability. Broadly speaking, generating investments, growth, and employment in a way which is much more mutually reinforcing, and also to avoid large economic swings, which, as I emphasized earlier, developing countries tend to be much more vulnerable to avoid gross external imbalances, and of course financial crisis as well. Now, the conventional approach to the question of what is called fiscal space, which is one aspect of a broader issue of policy space generally, is to take this view that an increase in expenditure that can be undertaken without impairing ability to service debt. Okay, this is particularly with regards to developing countries which are indebted. This kind of definition and this kind of approach tends to be biased against an imperative to promote growth and employment as fiscal policy objectives. And I would say that the same thing is true for other aspects as well. Now, the use of fiscal policy to offset cyclical downturns is often eschewed because it will ostensibly threaten government solvency. But the counter argument, of course, is that growth. It is growth which creates fiscal solvency, and not vice versa. It's not fiscal solvency which generates growth. Here, I refer to a number of issues which are important in terms of considerations in terms of trying to maintain fiscal balance. The ability to increase government investment depends on a number of conditions. I'll just run through this very quickly, as I know that I'm running over time, and I don't want to deprive my colleagues here of the opportunity to make their presentations with adequate time. So let me just run through this last bit here. Here, I want to emphasize that even recent OECD experiences tend to undermine the conventional claim that government solvency and macro stability are preconditions for long-term growth. This kind of relationship, which has often been presumed, is actually doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny. Countercyclical fiscal policy should contribute to solvency and to sustained mobilization of domestic resources. Now, what would constitute good fiscal policy? The conventional approach tends to reject adopting fiscal targets based on current fiscal balances, including capital expenditures, particularly structural current balances. And a differential, and we would basically argue that a much more careful approach, differentiating between the capital and current account expenditures would constitute not only good accounting policy but also good economic policy. So fiscal and trade policies, to sum up, are basically crucial for growth and structural change. Current fiscal policy emphasis on maintaining government solvency and consumer price stability tends not to promote the expansion of domestic demand. The recent emphasis on fiscal solvency and macro stability has tended to be detrimental to growth in developing countries. Fiscal space for development, developing countries should be taking a far greater responsibility for their own development through more effective national resource mobilization. They should be less subjected to the pressures of international tax competition. As you know, there has been a great deal of competition among countries to sort of reduce tax rates to attract investors and so on and so forth. And this, of course, has been detrimental. And the achievement of most goals requires really medium-term expenditure planning, and thus medium-term commitments to financing, including more stable and predictable aid. And unfortunately, currently, we find that much aid continues to be project aid rather than channeled through the budget, and this, of course, constrains countries. I'm going to skip over this last bit discussion on questions of human resources and infrastructure, because although these are important issues, and also on ODA, just to conclude on where what I've just said fits into a larger debate. I mentioned earlier that the bank particularly had adopted a number of structural adjustment programs through the 80s and into the 90s. These were subjected to a great deal of criticism, particularly because they were not seen to be affecting to be affecting poverty. And so since the late 90s, we have seen a switch to what are called poverty reduction strategies. Last year, as I mentioned earlier, the international community has favored what are called national development strategies rather than the poverty reduction strategies. The poverty reduction strategies, I should emphasize, have very little to do with reduction of poverty in any serious fashion. It's a name, and you will find that the poverty reduction strategies have very little to say about employment generation. And one cannot seriously conceive of how you're going to reduce poverty without generating employment. And in fact, there were two recent surveys, one for the world, and where less than a quarter of the poverty reduction strategy papers had anything significant to say about employment generation. And for Africa alone, Janvier Nkurunziza found that about 20% had anything to say about poverty. In other words, 80% had anything to say about employment. 80% of the poverty reduction strategy papers for Africa had nothing to say about employment generation. The Millennium Development Goals associated with the United Nations do not make strong enough recognition of the significance of employment generation, and this was corrected by the 2005 summit, which reiterated its commitment to what are called the internationally agreed development goals associated with the summits and conferences since the 1990s, and including the MDGs, but not confined to the MDGs. And so the whole question of employment generation has come back very much into center stage as far as the national development strategies are concerned. But the national development strategies also emphasize the whole question of national ownership and policy space as means of achieving these ends. So the recent work, our recent work basically suggests that there seems to be at least some movement towards some consensus on some issues. Last year, for example, both the report on the world social situation as well as the World Economic and Social Survey discussed the whole question of inequality and questions of divergences. The World Bank last year came out with the volume called Development in the 1990s, which was actually very self-critical of the role of the bank in terms of adversely affecting development prospects in much of the developing world. And the World Development Report for 2006 also dealt with questions of poverty. And this report, which I mentioned earlier, is very critical of World Bank operations as far as conditionalities are concerned. The whole emphasis on the relationship between the economic and social is now getting much more attention, and there's also recognition that there's no such thing as a single model. One size certainly doesn't fit all, and hence the diversity of national development strategies is very, very crucial part of this discussion. And we at the UN have been trying to develop what we call policy notes in a number of areas where, in a sense, we are trying to look at some issues perhaps rather differently from what is offered by the PRSP source book provided by the World Bank in the area of macroeconomic policy, finance, state and owned enterprises reform, trade, investment and technology policy, as well as social policy. So I'd like to thank you now, by way of conclusion, for this opportunity to sort of set out where our thinking is, at least in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York. So we recently have prepared a number of publications which have just I was involved in launching some of them this morning, some new publications which are trying to open up the debate in some of in these areas along the lines which I've just described, and these are some of the recent publications which we have come up with. So once again, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jomo, for your articulate presentation, and we're actually right on time. So we'll now start the panel discussion with the following three speakers and commentator. I will just take a couple minutes out to introduce the speakers. Heiner Flassbeck, to my right, is the director of the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies at UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Previously, he was State Secretary of the German Federal Ministry of Finance and was responsible for international affairs, the European Union, and the International Monetary Fund. He is a lead author within the team preparing UNCTAD's Annual Trade and Development Report for 2006. Heiner Flassbeck will speak today on macroeconomic policy under globalization. To my left is Carlos Correa, who is director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies of Industrial Property Law and Economics at the University of Buenos Aires. He is a professor and expert consultant in the area of intellectual property regimes, investment, science, and technology. He was a member of the UK International Commission on Intellectual Property and of the Commission on Intellectual Property Innovation and Public Health, established by the World Health Assembly in 2004. Carlos Correa is the author of several books and articles on law and economics, and he will speak today on the impact trade agreements have on designing intellectual property regimes for development. Elaine Zuckerman is president and founder of Gender Action and has worked in the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank for 2 decades. In the World Bank, she created the first global program to prevent the harmful social impacts on the poor and especially on women of economic policy reforms contained in structural adjustment programs. In the Inter-American Development Bank, she created the first strategy for the Amazon that prohibited environment-damaging investments and encouraged public services investments. Elaine Zuckerman will speak today on the gendered impacts of World Bank and International Monetary Fund policy-based loans. Mark Allen is Director of the Policy Development and Review Department at the International Monetary Fund and is the commentator today. Mark Allen began his career at the International Monetary Fund in 1974 and has worked in the Exchange and Trade Relations Department, the Africa Department, and the Europe Department. He has worked in the Policy Development and Review Division on numerous occasions, first as a senior advisor and later as deputy director. After the panel, Mark Allen will provide his comments.
Thank you very much for inviting me today to talk a bit about the macroeconomic policy dimension of policy space debate, macroeconomic policy under globalization. What I'm going to do is following up quite nicely, I think, to what my colleague from New York has been talking about already, namely the question how developing countries were, so to say, thrown into the cold water of a globalized economy, were more or less under pressure, asked or forced to liberalize a lot of markets, but that was done, unfortunately, without thinking about the consequences of, some of the consequences at least, the macroeconomic consequences of this kind of approach. And this is my main topic today, namely why policy space debate in macroeconomics. Well, we have to think about the severe financial crisis that many countries have gone through. We had Asian crisis, we had Mexican crisis first, then we had Asian crisis, financial crisis, then we had Latin American financial crisis, with deep and severe consequences, even consequences close to a collapse of the whole political system of some countries, like in Argentina. And coming out of this crisis, I think, is one having to be forced or having gone through this crisis is one of the important reasons why developing countries realize that they need more control over their external sector, at least, and they need to have a policy space to influence what happens to them and not just being dependent on international markets. And that has a lot to do with the thing that we call today global imbalances, and I try to show the link between this search for policy space in developing countries and the global imbalances. And I think I can show then some paradoxes of the approach that the developed countries had in the first round in the financial crisis, in trying to settle the financial crisis, and now in trying to put pressure on developing countries to, so to say, remove or reduce their policy space again. What happened at the beginning of the 90s mainly? In the beginning of the 90s, most of the developing countries under the guidance of the IMF and the World Bank and other institutions were asked to quickly open their markets, not only the goods market, but the capital markets. And that was all done under the regime that we call Washington Consensus, which mainly concentrated on the question, or was phrased as getting the prices right, making markets flexible, getting the prices right so that the prices could play and the markets could do their job, and namely to create growth and to, what is very important, it is sometimes forgotten, to create conversion, as Jomo has shown. Conversion is the most important thing, and strange enough, nobody has shown up to now that markets are able to create conversion. Markets may be able to create growth, but whether they're able to create catching up of developing countries is a very open question. But that was the idea behind the Washington Consensus. Funny enough is that the Washington Consensus was absolutely silent, although focusing on getting the prices right, so to say, getting the micro prices right, was absolutely silent about the macro prices. So the question how to settle into an international monetary system that was, after the end of Bretton Woods, something like chaos where every country tried to find its own solution for fixing or not fixing the exchange rate, that question was not dealt at all with. Countries were just thrown into the cold water of open capital markets without saying how they should steer, how they should should they work on their external sector, on the exchange rate. The exchange rate is by far the most important international price, and how to determine their interest rate, because they are closely related, exchange rate and interest rates. Nobody said something about that. And only in the course of the 90s, something emerged that was called then later on here in the IMF, the corner solutions. So countries should either absolutely fix the exchange rate or float the exchange rate. That came rather late when many things had gone wrong already. So what happened? The countries tried to find pragmatic, obviously unilateral solution to the exchange rate problem. Many of the countries indeed fixed the exchange rate. They fixed the exchange rate, and in an attempt, and that was the most dominating motive, in an attempt to use the exchange rate as an anchor, as an external anchor to bring down inflation, because bringing down inflation, having what is called sound macroeconomic conditions, was seen as the most important and, so to say, the only precondition that was needed, that was a government responsibility to give the markets the chance to work effectively. But the thing is that fixing the exchange rate to anchor your currency and to bring down inflation is a difficult thing. As many people in Europe would have known or should have known and knew, actually, that is always a big danger, because what it normally implies overvaluation, because that is exactly what you have to do. You have to overvalue your currency to bring down inflation through cheap imports. The idea was by cheap imports, not by import substitution, but just the other way around, by cheap imports to bring down inflation and to improve competitiveness and to improve competition first, not to improve competitiveness, to lower competitiveness, overall competitiveness of the economy, with the idea at the end to have then a really effective and efficient economy. This worked out badly because no country in the world can live permanently with overvaluation. The European experience was very clear. Once you have reached 20% overvaluation, it's over. Then the collapse will come sooner or later, because the markets then suddenly, and it's true, suddenly, not systematically, but the markets suddenly realize, oh, there's something wrong in that economy. Something might happen. There is a shock coming about, or the country's current account is going so much into deficit that sooner or later the exchange rate has to collapse. And then starts a speculation against the currency. And with this speculation against the currency, then governments totally lose control over the external sector. That is what happened. They totally lost control over the external sector in terms of policy control. They had, so to say, brought in competition at very low prices. They favored their competitors for their own companies, but they totally had lost control over the external sector. Their interest rates were dictated by the financial markets, and the exchange rate was the punching ball of the international speculation. And then the crisis set in, and then only at a very late stage, when it was most of the time too late, then the IMF and other institutions and the G7 obviously stepped in by producing packages, aid packages to help the countries out of the calamities. But that was definitely too late. So what happened after the crisis? And this is the interesting thing. The ex post situation of most of the developing countries, the after-crisis situation, is much better than the pre-crisis situation. And that is understandable, because now they do what any reasonable person would ever have recommended to them, namely not to have an overvalued exchange rate, but to have an undervalued exchange rate. So now to go, so to say, for the approach that with different means, with monetary means, that would say, well, try to keep international competition at so to say, a reasonable level, and not artificially increase external competition to your own companies, but have some kind of import substitution regime and give some, as you said, give some export subsidization. That was done through the exchange rate, namely through a dramatically devalued exchange rate. And this devaluation of the exchange rates gave countries a policy space that some of them still have, but that we are going to endanger actually by putting pressure on developing countries, and where we are producing new crises and new deep dilemmas for many developing countries. Because what happened after the devaluation, the countries realized, oh, it's nice to be in the international market with a devalued exchange rate. Your competitiveness has dramatically improved. Your companies are doing well. And most of the countries, surprise, surprise, realized that their supply elasticity was quite high. I was visiting Latin America in 2000, just after the Brazilian devaluation, or no, it was 2001, after even the Argentinian devaluation. Everybody said, oh, we are not flexible enough. Our supply capacities are not flexible enough to react to the devaluation, to make use of the devaluation. And 2 years later, they were happy. They said, oh, we are so good exporters. How comes that we are suddenly we are doing so well in the international markets? Well, it was due to the fact that even their companies, their entrepreneurs were able to make use of the devaluation. If you realize, and that you can textbook-like study in Argentina and in Brazil for some time. Unfortunately, now in Brazil it's gone already again. But in Argentina, you can study it. There, the companies made use of the devaluation, although the fact is clear that devaluation was a very harsh adjustment for many people. For the average people, it was a dramatic and harsh adjustment. But for the company sector, it paid out rather quickly. And if you look now at Argentina, for example, even employment has increased in the last years dramatically due to the fact that the country, and plus the obviously the commodity boom in the world, but even in the manufactured sector, that the country is doing much better because their terms of trade have fallen due to the devaluation, but there in these manufactured markets, the elasticity is so high that what we call the income terms of trade have improved. That means the overall revenue has improved. And that has shown to many developing countries what is a reasonable way out of this policy space dilemma. Namely, what you have to do is very simple. You fix your exchange rate at an undervalued level. That is the solution to the problem. Because at an undervalued level, the markets are speculating for appreciation of your currency. But if the markets are speculating for appreciation, you're in a much better situation than the other way around. Because appreciation you can fight by printing money, by intervening in the market and just printing your own money. Depreciation you only can fight with international reserves, and they are limited. They're always limited. Even 1,000 billion, as China has now, is not sufficient to fight a speculation, because the speculation easily can extrapolate when even $1,000 billion will be depleted if, as in the case of Correa and other countries, 5 billion a day are lost. So that is what happened, in my opinion. That, so to say, as Martin Wolf in the Financial Times some time ago, unfortunately, without quoting our Trade and Development report, we had it first, said, by accident, so to say, the world has found a solution to its crisis-prone financial sector. And this accident is the financial crisis. This accident is the devaluation of the currencies. And after the devaluation of the currencies, really many countries got control over their acts and over their overall external sector. And this is even true for China, but is very often forgotten. China had a financial crisis too. China's financial crisis went mostly overlooked by the international scene, but in 1993, China had a big financial crisis, and the Chinese currency at that time devalued sharply. It devalued by 30–40%, and after this devaluation, the Chinese government went for a solution to fix the exchange rate at the famous rate of 8–1, but only after a sharp devaluation. It's, so to say, exactly the Chinese solution that many developing countries have used after their financial crisis. So that means that we are now as I do not have to mention that the corner solutions that the IMF had been proposing, namely absolutely fixing, didn't work. Everybody or nobody ever mentioned that now as after the Argentinian collapse, but before the Argentinian collapse, everybody believed it could go on for a time. It can never go on if the, so to say, the purpose of that system is to bring down inflation, because then overvaluation is unavoidable. The logic is implied by the kind of adjustment of the system. Floating never work. Floating did never work, and that is easy to understand too. Floating doesn't work because the markets are not stabilizing. The international financial markets are not stabilizing. Just in contrast to what the just passed away Milton Friedman always had taught us, that speculation is stabilizing. It is not stabilizing. It is destabilizing. If you look every day at the market, you see what carry trade does. People taking money, asking for credit in a low interest rate country and carrying it to a high interest rate country. That is just the opposite of stabilizing speculation. It's destabilizing as long as, or up to the point where then the international financial crisis comes. If you carry permanently, let's say, money from Japan to Brazil, that will end up in a crisis in Brazil because, as we see, the Brazilian exchange rate goes up and not down, despite the fact that inflation in Brazil is much higher than in Japan, despite the fact that the interest rate is much higher in Brazil than in Japan, because the markets do not have the rational expectation that the Brazilian real has to devalue because the inflation there is higher than in Japan. At least not for, say, to say, a time between 1 day and 20 years. And that is what the IMF has found out for some time ago, that sure, the famous stabilization of exchange rate, the purchasing power parity theory holds over 20 years. There it holds, but it doesn't hold in between. And as it does not hold in between, we have a dramatic destabilization of the international capital flows. And that means floating is not feasible. All developing countries fear floating, and that is quite well established now in the economic literature. So fixing is no solution, floating is no solution. Then the only solution was fixing, but at an undervalued level. But obviously, this comes at a price, because not everybody in the world can have an undervalued currency. That is obvious. Someone must have an overvalued currency. Not everyone can have a current account surplus, as many developing countries now have, but someone must have a current account deficit. And here's the link that I mentioned at the beginning. We have the solution. We have a stable, policy space, friendly solution in the developing countries after the financial crisis, but this has contributed to a very large extent. I do not want to mention now the other surplus countries in the world, namely my own country, Germany, and Japan, which are fighting for competitiveness with a lot of means that should not be accepted by the international community, in my opinion. But nevertheless, a big contribution for the global imbalances comes from the fact that developing countries have been searching for a stable solution, for a solution that gave them policy space to have control, that gave them control over their external sector, and did not make them the punching ball of the international markets. That is very important. And having that in mind, we have to think about what the solution for this problem is. And obviously, it is no solution now to push developing countries out of their stable undervaluation. But that is exactly what the developed countries are doing. They're trying to push them out by putting political pressure and other pressure on these countries to appreciate. But the end of the appreciation can only be that anew they are put into the fragility, or in a fragile situation where the international speculation can speculate on a depreciation of the currency, and where they're lost alone and left alone on the international markets, and only after the crisis the international community is willing to step in. This is very important to have in mind, that the stable solution that developing countries have is the result of financial crisis, and not just something that they thought about and they designed, so to say, in a way to make them more independent of the international capital markets. And one thing, or I should mention that it is very important to notice that it's very difficult to keep the solution stable. If you look at the Chinese and some of the Asian countries that are able to run for it, to keep their exchange rate stable vis-à-vis the dollar, have current account surpluses, export capital, yes, but at the same time having to intervene in the currency market to keep the exchange rate stable, it is only possible if these countries are able, and that is interesting, if they're able to have, so to say, sound monetary policies, namely sound monetary conditions, namely low inflation rate and low interest rates. Only if you are able to keep your inflation low, not by monetary means, not by permanently having high interest rates, but by non-monetary instruments, so to say a flexible labor market, one would say in the United States, having these conditions, then you are able to go for that solution, because then only your intervention is not extremely costly. If, as it was in China the case for now 15 years, people are bringing their money to China and getting 3% interest, and China is investing that money in the United States for 6%, this policy can go on forever, because that is not very expensive. It's just printing money and sending it to the United States. And even a loss incurred on, in terms of a fall in the dollar for some time would not hurt anybody in China. It would just be a loss in the books, but not something that would really materially hit the Chinese economy. So this solution, as I said, is only possible with a very disciplined approach to inflation, with a very disciplined approach to the overall economy, but we're trying to just put them out of this. This is paradox, in my opinion, because if we acknowledge and realize that at the bottom of this solution that the developing countries found was the unwillingness or the inability, but it was more obviously the unwillingness of the developed countries of the United States, of Europe, and of Japan to consider any kind of multilateral solution for the international monetary system. This was at the bottom of the trouble, because any solution, they were unwilling to go for any multilateral solution. Let me give you an example. I was myself in the negotiations about the Brazilian financial crisis here with the IMF and the G7 with my former colleague Larry Summers here, some feet away from here in the Treasury, and we were discussing what would be a feasible solution for Brazil, and everybody knew. The IMF knew. Everybody said it. Stanley Fischer, at that time executive deputy of the IMF, said explicitly, Brazil needs a devaluation of around 20 to 25%. Everybody knew it, that it would be something like that. But the solution was, in the end, to float the Brazilian currency. And the devaluation of Brazil was 30 to 40 or 50%. And that killed Argentina. Would the international community have been prepared to go for a solution where Brazil and Argentina are treated as a package? And they were a package because they have been the most important trading partners for one another. And would the international community have been willing to say, we are willing to stop at a certain point of time the devaluation of the Brazilian real? That would have cost nobody nothing, absolutely nothing. Because if the G7 would have come out with a press release saying, we are considering 25% enough for the Brazilian real to fall, no speculator in the world would have tried to challenge that statement. And they would have not having been forced to intervene $1. I'm absolutely sure about it. But there was no willingness to do that. Why was there no willingness? Because it is a dogma. It is a dogma in the big countries, and it's not only true for the United States, it's true for Europe as well, and in certain respects even for Japan. It's a dogma not to engage in stabilizing the international financial system. The international financing system, in their dogma, is self-stabilizing. And if it is not self-stabilizing, then the only thing we are willing to do is to go for emergency packages afterwards. But firstly, let the market decide whatever the market wants to decide. Whatever the consequences are. We are not willing to engage in any kind of obligation to stabilize a multilateral system. And here we are at the core of the problem, in my opinion. This is the core of the problem. We have a multilateral phenomenon that we call the exchange rate, and it's by definition a multilateral phenomenon. But nobody, or at least part of the world, is not willing at all to consider it as a multilateral phenomenon. The famous corner solutions that the IMF recommended were only so wonderful in their view because they seemed to be unilateral solutions. You unilaterally fix your exchange rate at 1-to-1, fixing forever, it was called in Argentina, or you float your exchange rate and then the market will nicely decide what the right exchange rate is. And both are not implying any obligation of the big powers of those countries with strong currencies to engage in stabilizing the international market, because that is not allowed by this kind of dogma. And as long as we're not willing and able to overcome that dogma and consider solutions like the old Bretton Woods system, at least Bretton Woods-like solutions for the international monetary system, we will not be able to do any other kind of permanent stabilization. Then we are relying on this kind of accidental solutions that the world has found now for a couple of years, but that is just right now, so to say, passing away, slowly, step by step, passing away. We have to consider multilateral solutions. We have to consider international engagement, because without that, and here I conclude quite close to what Jomo has been saying a couple of minutes ago, because without a multilateral monetary system, the whole multilateral trading system is not functioning at all. Because what are we talking about? If we talk about the international trading system, if we talk about multilateral disciplines, if at the same time we let the most important price, and it's not only the most important price for financial markets, but the most important price for the trading system, for the trade flows, if we let that be determined by a chaos, by a chaotic regulation where one country does this, the other country does the other thing, some go for managed floating, some have kind of dirty floating, some are permanently dumping, so to say, the exchange rate, and others are letting it float, and the market decides up and down whatever happens. This all influences trade flows. But as long as this chaos goes on, the whole trading system will never come to a reasonable and efficient allocation of resources. Thank you very much.
You deserve more than that.
I don't need it now, but when I need, what should I do?
It should just start.
This one?
Yeah. It should just start.
See.
See, some of this stuff I tried to bring into the WESP, but it was impossible.
But I need the slides.
By the time it reached me, maybe I wasn't paying enough attention, but it was seen as seeking
Okay.
seeking a solution to the imbalances by developing renminbi appreciation.
This is my presentation now.
Yeah, it should be.
At least today I heard.
This is not.
Here we go. It's probably this be it?
Can
Okay.
I put it off now? And then
Sure.
This. But now you just put it off.
So you don't want to. Okay, here's what we can do. Just minimize it, and then
When you're ready for it, you can just bring it up. Okay.
All right. Well, sorry for this technical delay. Well, I'm also very thankful for the invitation. I have been requested to talk about policy space in the area of intellectual property. So this is a very different picture, what the one you have just heard. So it's like coming to the cinema, paying one entrance fee, but looking at a different picture, look at different films. My presentation will address essentially three issues. The first one, I'll try to make a little of history about the evolution of the intellectual property system and try to draw some lessons from that. And I will refer a lot to the history of the United States because we are in the United States. The second issue is I will examine the situation today with regard to policy space in the area of intellectual property, particularly in respect of developing countries. And thirdly, I will consider some further developments that are taking place, especially on the basis of the so-called free trade agreements or bilateral agreements between the United States and other countries. So regarding history, the intellectual property system was born in its international dimension, essentially at the end of the 19th century, with two major conventions, the Paris Convention on Industrial Property and the Berne Convention on Copyright. If we look at these conventions, we will see that they gave a lot of flexibilities to all member countries in order to develop their own systems of protection for industrial property on the one hand and copyright on the other hand. For instance, in the case of the Paris Convention, countries were free to provide or not patent protection in certain fields of technology. Many countries, as you probably know, decided to exclude, for instance, patentability of pharmaceutical products. When the Oriel round started in 1986, more than 50 countries in the world did not grant patents for pharmaceuticals, including a number of developed countries. Also, the Paris Convention did not set a specific duration for patents. You could have patents, for instance, like French legislation, for 5, 10, or 15 years. And you have a lot of flexibility to determine the rights to be granted and also to provide, in some cases, what is called compulsory license. That means an authorization given by the state for the third party to use an invention without the consent of the owner of the patent. At the time this convention was adopted, many countries used to discriminate against national and foreigners because they wanted to give more protection to national companies and avoid monopolies to be created by foreign companies. And in fact, this was also done by the United States at the early stages of the application of the patent law. In the case of the United States, until 1836, foreigners were not able to get patents in the United States. And after that date, they were able to do that, but the fees that foreigners were charged were 10 times the fees charged to locals. In the case of the copyright, we had a similar picture. The Copyright Convention, the Berne Convention, provides for a little more detailed standards regarding protection for copyright, but still it left a significant flexibility for countries to adopt different legislation. For instance, under the Berne Convention, it was possible to develop the so-called fair use clause that allows for private uses, for copying, for research, and so on. The Berne Convention allowed for the famous dichotomy in this area between the protection of the expression while leaving free the ideas that are included in a work protected under copyright, the so-called idea expression dichotomy. And again, if we look at the history in the United States, we see that quite interestingly, in the United States there was a clear discrimination between national and foreign authors, in this case until 1891. It's interesting, for instance, if you look at the fight that some English authors had in the United States, like Mark Twain, that was one very, very well-known case, and also Charles Dickens, they lobbied very, very hard in the United States in order to get protection for their works, because there was no protection at all for foreign works in the United States until 1891. So all the British authors' works and all the foreigners' works were pirated here. For instance, in the case of one novel by Dickens, it was sold at the equivalent of $2.50 in London, and it was obtainable in the United States for only 6 cents. When Dickens came to the United States to lobby for the adoption of international copyright, when he went back, he wrote a book, it's called American Notes, where he showed his frustration because of lack of protection for foreign works in the United States. His book was sold in the United States the next year for a few cents. 50,000 pirated copies, it is reported, were sold in 3 days. So this ended up in 1891, as I mentioned. But what is interesting is to look at the arguments that were made at that time why the United States should not grant protection for foreign authors. And there were 4 main arguments. The first one was that expanding literacy demands cheap yet excellent books. The second one is there is no inherent property right in literature. This is just a right to prevent copying. The third one is granting copyright to foreigners would give them a monopoly at the expense of U.S. reading public. And the fourth one is U.S. publishers and their employees need the de facto advantage afforded by the absence of protection. As you can see, these could be very good arguments for many poor countries today. In some poor countries in Africa, for instance, you have hundreds of students chasing for 1 copy of a book, because it's not possible to make copies of the book. They are very expensive. And certainly these arguments could be applied there. But as we will see in a moment, these countries cannot do the same as the United States did at that time of its development stage. If we look at the situation in the industrial property area, we can also see that on the basis of a flexible system established by the Paris Convention that I mentioned before, it was possible for many countries to make a technological catching up, such as the case of Japan or later South Korea. They made important contributions in terms of global welfare, development, technological process. They based their industrialization on imitation. Imitation is generally bad word for lawyers, but this is not a bad word for economists, because in practice, every day, companies imitate among themselves, and they improve on the basis of what they see others are doing. If you visit, for instance, one of the museums here in Washington, you will see how the United States brought technology from England in the 18th and 19th century, and how the United States imitated British technology, improved on it, and then this was the very basis of the phenomenal process of industrialization in the United States. So this flexible framework for intellectual property under the Paris Convention, in fact, allowed the development of many countries and made important contributions to global welfare. But now this is the end of the story. I think we can draw some conclusions from this, and this is the fact that flexibility in intellectual property is not a bad thing by itself. It certainly depends a lot on the level of development of the countries and on the possibilities to exploit the intellectual assets that intellectual property protects. But now, what has happened after all this flexibility? Well, as we know, maybe some people in the room knows this better than myself, this has come to an end. For various reasons, of course, there is a lot of research and development investment in many countries, such as in the United States. 66% of the whole research and development expenditures in these countries is done by the business sector itself. This is a formal part of their activities. There has been an expansion in the areas of science and technology. New areas have emerged, such as biotechnology, or software, microelectronics, more recently nanotechnology. And there has been also a strong influence by a number of industry groups that have pushed for a globalized system of intellectual property protection. As it was mentioned, the market has become more global, and then companies are not only concerned with getting returns on their investments in intellectual property in their own markets, but also in foreign markets. And this was essentially what moved the United States to bring the intellectual property issues to GATT and initiate the negotiation of what we call now the TRIPS agreement. But clearly, in all this process that has led to a more rigid system of intellectual property as compared to what we had in the past, some industry sectors played a major role. This cannot be ignored. If we look, for instance, at what Mr. Pratt, he was the CEO of Pfizer, said in 1995, immediately after the adoption of the TRIPS agreement in the framework of the World Trade Organization. He said the current GATT victory, this was a victory for some interest, which established provisions for intellectual property, resulted in part from the hard-fought efforts of the US government and US businesses, which is really true, including Pfizer, which was a leading company in this process over the past 3 decades. We've been in it from the beginning, taking a leadership role. And this is really true. If you even look today at what is going on in framing intellectual property regimes in countries with which the United States is establishing free trade agreements through the USTR, you will see that there is an advisory body to USTR. This is called today IFAC 3. IFAC 3 is composed, among others, by the International Intellectual Property Alliance, which is an alliance of business interested in this area, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, Pharma, the Biotechnology Industry Association, Time Warner, the Recording Industry Association of America, so on and so forth. You don't see really many organizations representing the public interest view, the consumer's view, or even the views of the generic industries. And this is the body advising USTR today about the free trade agreements I will refer in a few minutes. So the negotiations, if we can call them such, in the framework of GATT, led to the adoption of the TRIPS agreement that changed significantly the scenario, because now there are minimum standards that all countries that are members to WTO need to comply with. So it imposed, for instance, the obligation to grant patents in all fields of technology. And then the possibility of not granting patents in pharmaceuticals was completely deleted. It established copyright protection for software, for computer programs. It established, in a very arbitrary manner, a minimum duration for patents for 20 years. So economists have discussed for a long time what the optimal duration of the patent should be. Why shouldn't it be 5 or 10 years? But it was decision to make it for 20 years. Be interested to know what the reason for this is. The exclusive rights granted to patent owners, trademark owners, so on and so forth, were defined in a very precise manner. And finally, a new system for the protection of trade secret was introduced for the first time internationally, including for the protection of the so-called test data submitted by pharmaceutical and agrochemical companies for getting approval of their products. So the TRIPS agreement established these minimum standards. This is not, however, a uniform law. The TRIPS agreement does allow some room of flexibility. There is still some policy space under the TRIPS agreement. For instance, countries may provide for this compulsory license I have referred to in cases of emergencies or anti-competitive practices or other situations. They may allow for parallel imports. Probably you in the United States, you've read a lot about parallel imports from Canada of medicines because are cheaper in Canada than in the United States. This is actually allowed by the TRIPS agreement. And other measures are also possible, including some flexibility to determine what is patentable, for instance. But quite clearly, the TRIPS agreement is based on the philosophy that stronger and more intellectual property rights are better for global welfare. And some people and many scholars, in fact, in the United States, I would say that in the main universities in the United States, especially economists, lawyers have a different view in general on these subjects. economists are very critical about this thesis that more intellectual property rights brings more innovation, more benefit. For instance, one is Professor Boyle at Duke University. He wrote a manifesto on these issues where he says that the assumption seems to be that to promote intellectual property is automatically to promote innovation, and in that process, the more rights, the better. But both assumptions are categorically false. And there are many economists that have developed these ideas, and perhaps it's very easy to understand. Essentially, intellectual property provides an incentive. It's an incentive to invest, it's an incentive to innovate, it's an incentive to create. But quite clearly, an incentive works differently depending on the context in which that incentive applies. So, for instance, the patent incentive only works if if it is applied in a country where there is a sophisticated scientific and technological infrastructure, if you have the right human people, if you have the capital, you have the funding. But the patent system does not promote any innovation at all in countries where there are no such conditions. So, like any other incentive you may get in any aspect of your life, it clearly depends on the capacity to use that incentive. And certainly, this is not the same for countries with low, medium, or high technological development and capacity to undertake this development. One example I just wanted to give you relates to the pharmaceutical industry. As you know, the pharmaceutical industry invests quite heavily in research and development, at least this is what is reported. The protection for pharmaceutical industry has expanded globally. As I mentioned, patents for pharmaceuticals now need to be recognized in all countries, members of WTO. Only the least developed countries are out of this obligation, but these are really very insignificant markets, very, very, very small economies. The pharmaceutical industry, in particular, the US pharmaceutical industry, continues to be one of the most profitable industries in the economy. Well, now with the oil prices is perhaps second or third, but is one of the most profitable industries, and it has been for the last 2 decades. But still, we face a problem with the pharmaceutical industry, and this is despite the fact that in addition to this additional funding the industry is getting from all over the world because of the expansion of the intellectual property system, the fact is that the rate of innovation of the pharmaceutical industry is declining dramatically. Here you have a graph showing the new chemical entities developed in the last, since 1994, and as you can see, there is a clear decline. This has also raised the concerns of the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, which published a couple of years ago a report indicating that something is going on, especially because today there are new technological and scientific tools. Now we have genomics, we have proteomics, we have the so-called combinatorial chemistry. There are so many important new technological tools. There is so much money in the business, but the innovation is going down. So this shows that more intellectual property, and in particular the expansion of protection to all over the world, does not solve the problem. And this is also, in particular, here if you look at the figures, 90% of the income of pharmaceutical companies is made in developed countries. Developing countries only contribute between 5 to 7% of the profits of the pharmaceutical companies. So this means that whatever increase in intellectual property protection in developing countries takes place, the contributions made for research and development by the parent companies is minimal. Another consideration is that despite all this expansion of intellectual property in developing countries, in particular in pharmaceuticals, we still face a very serious problem. And this is that these companies do not invest in the diseases that prevail in the developing countries. The companies do a lot of research and development, but of course there is an opportunity cost, and this research and development is focused on those diseases which are profitable which are the diseases that prevailed in developed countries. And then this is a problem sometimes called of the neglected diseases. If you look at some statistics, in the last 2 or 3 decades, only 1% of the new chemical entities developed addressed diseases that prevail in developing countries. A study that was made by the Commission mentioned, the Commission established by the World Health Assembly on intellectual property, innovation, and public health, clearly indicated that patents do not promote innovation with regard to diseases that prevail in developing countries, simply because patents work where profitable markets exist. If these markets do not exist, patents do not provide an incentive for developing these drugs. Well, in any case, the TRIPS agreement probably represented a good deal for developed countries, not certainly probably for developing countries. Statistics from the US show that between 1998 and 2004, payments of royalties and fees for technology, copyright, so on and so forth, increased from 61 billion to 120 billion. So I repeat, between 1998 and 2004, in 6 years, the increase in royalty payments was 61 billion to 120 billion, double. Most of these benefits accrue, as you can see in this graph, to the United States, that received in 1998 a little more than 30 billion, and now is approaching 60 billion in receipts in the concept of license fees and royalties. Again, the good news of the TRIPS agreement is, as I mentioned, it's not a uniform law, and this has allowed some flexibilities that were confirmed, in fact, by the Doha Declaration adopted by the WTO Ministerial Conference in 1991. This was an important declaration for developing countries because this declaration was adopted by consensus by all ministers, indicated that, in particular in the area of public health, the TRIPS agreement must be interpreted and implemented in a way that protects public health. And this declaration also confirms the flexibilities that the TRIPS agreement allows in some of the areas I have already mentioned, such as compulsory licensing, parallel imports, and so on and so forth. But the celebration that developing countries made when this declaration was adopted was really a short one, because at that same year, or during that same period, even before that, in the year 2000, a new trend emerged. And this is the trend towards free trade agreements, or so-called bilateral agreements, especially promoted by the United States, some also promoted by the European Union, which include a large number of matters relating to trade, but also a very important chapter on intellectual property. This chapter on intellectual property is a TRIPS Plus chapter, just to put it simply. It reiterates the obligation that countries have under TRIPS, but adds to those obligations a number of new obligations that increase the level of protection that the partner countries need to provide to intellectual property. As you know, a number of countries have signed these agreements, such as Jordan, such as Morocco, the Central American countries, the Dominican Republic, Peru and Colombia, and some of them are now before U.S. Congress or still under consideration here. Essentially, these free trade agreements have eroded the flexibilities that the TRIPS agreement had respected. Under the TRIPS agreement, for instance, in the case of Jordan, the grounds for granting compulsory licenses have been limited. Under the FTAs, in general, there is an increase in the term of protection for patents. I mentioned that TRIPS moved the term of protection for 20 years. Under the FTAs with the United States, there is an obligation to even further extend the term of protection for patents in case of delays in the examination of the patents or delays in the examination for the approval of medicines. In some cases, parallel imports are also precluded. So just to make this long story short, if you look at these chapters, which are not really negotiated, I have participated in some of the processes relating to the adoption of FTAs in the case of Andean countries. I can certainly testify that there is no real negotiation. There is a text submitted by the USTR, and there is very little room. You may change a comma, perhaps 2 or 3 words, very little room or no room at all to make a real negotiation. But then to conclude, there are a number of paradoxes in this new scenario of TRIPS Plus, of FTAs. The first one is that the countries with which some of these FTAs have been established are countries with a very low income, very low domestic product, with very high levels of poverty, such as Salvador, Guatemala, where really the trade interests of the United States, including pharmaceutical industry, are minimal. What I argue in this case is that the cost imposed by higher intellectual property protection in these countries are disproportionate to the benefits that the companies get, because clearly these markets are very, very small for these companies. The additional benefits they get is minimal. However, the monopoly rights that are created in these countries have a very direct impact on the consumers, on the people. They cannot really buy these products. And this in particular has a very, very heavy burden, or creates very heavy burden in the case of pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals, and other essential products. So I don't really see the rationale of imposing these high levels of intellectual property protection to countries with these levels of poverty, where the benefits to be obtained by the US companies are so minimal. A second paradox is that some of the obligations imposed under these FTAs go even beyond what is under the US law. What I mean is that the standards imposed provide for protection which in Guatemala or in Salvador, which is higher than the protection conferred to the same companies in the United States. For instance, the so-called linkage, the obligation imposed in the FTAs not to grant an approval for a medicine if there is a patent, and this is an obligation imposed on the state itself. This does not exist in the United States, and I think this is inconceivable. The FDA is just refusing an application by a generic company because there is a patent. The FDA will say, well, there is an application by a generic company. You just go and litigate. You just go to the court and defend your rights because these are private rights. But in the case of FTAs, these private rights are transformed in some kind of public rights because the patent holders are directly defended by the state. This does not exist in the United States. In the case of patent term extension, for instance, under the FTAs, there is no limit for these extensions of patents. In the case of the United States, there are limits. It cannot be more than 5 years. It cannot be more than 14 years of effective protection in the case of pharmaceuticals, but you don't find this in the FTA. So you come to this second paradox, that these provisions establish levels of protection which are higher than the protection conferred in the United States, and certainly the development, the income available, levels of poverty in between these countries are not comparable. And the third paradox is that while these FTAs will be certainly binding on El Salvador, Guatemala, Jordan, so on and so forth, these FTAs, I would say, will be never implemented in the United States. Because, as you know, these are not considered as treaties. Even in the case of the adoption of the outcomes of the Uruguay Round, the Uruguay Round Agreements Act of 1994 established very specifically that in case of inconsistency between a provision of one of the WTO agreements and a provision of the national US law, the national US law will prevail. And I think there is little or no chance at all that these bilateral agreements will be actually implemented in the United States. And they will have a very particular situation in which all these countries have been moved into patterns of protection of intellectual property higher than that conferred in the United States without any prospect of having a real bilateral treatment. And then just to conclude, let me say that what I have tried to prove is that clearly policy space in the area of intellectual property, as well as in other areas that have been mentioned, is clearly very important. We had that type of flexibility before the adoption of the TRIPS agreement and these new trends for FTAs. But although I think everybody recognizes that intellectual property provides an incentive for creativity and innovation, we should also recognize that that incentive depends essentially on where and how and when you apply it. It cannot work in the same way as it works in developed countries in particular. So we cannot overstate, certainly, the role of intellectual property as a promoter of innovation and creativity. And secondly, I think that if we look at history, perhaps the global welfare will be improved if more flexibility were introduced rather than more rigidity, as it is the case today. And perhaps historians still have, and economists still have a lot of work to do here in order to test this hypothesis. As it was mentioned before, the World Bank, I don't always agree with the conclusions of the World Bank in many areas, but the World Bank in the year 2001 published a report that included a chapter on intellectual property. And the main conclusion of the World Bank in this report was, as it was mentioned, in the area of intellectual property, one size does not fit all. That means you need to differentiate. You need to allow countries with different levels of development different types of protection. Thank you very much.
Could this computer go?
Thank you. Well, thank you for making time to attend. Whoops. Sorry about that. And for those of you who are still here, for sticking it out. And thank you, Bhumika, for inviting me. Oh, this thing keeps popping. I don't think we need it. If it falls again, I won't use it. As Bhumika requested, I plan to focus my remarks today on both gender and on the international financial institutions. I notice, by the way, that I'm the only speaker here from civil society organizations. But our audience includes a number of my civil society colleagues who have been addressing the issues that Gender Action addresses, and I hope that they'll supplement, correct me, etc. afterward during the comments. As a prelude, I have a short commercial for Gender Action, and that is just totally serendipitously and coincidentally our publication that you picked up, hopefully, A Gender Guide to World Bank and IMF Policy-Based Lending, was printed for the first time today, this morning. It is just perfect timing. And today I will actually draw on some examples from this publication. I'd also like to point out that the key author of this publication, Susanna Dennis, who co-authored it with me, is here in the audience. Do you want to stand up, Susanna? Just let people know who you are. Thanks. So please take copies of this guide and of Gender Action's brochure that's also sitting out there. That's the end of my commercial. To start, I want to share with you that today is the second time that I am presenting here at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and that the first time was a long time ago, in 1988, almost 20 years ago. But what is fascinating is that I presented on virtually the same topic as today. The topic I presented on here in 1988, well, actually in the old castle, as a previous speaker mentioned, was on the social impacts of structural adjustment loans, what we call SALs, and what you've been hearing about today. So I think the fact that my topic in 1988 and today underlines the long intractability of IFI, International Financial Institutions, conditionalities that are the essence of structural adjustment loans. So this is not surprising because IFIs have been pushing conditionalities, SALs, for a quarter of a century. Drawing on my own experiences, first working inside the IFIs and later outside them as a critic of IFIs, I'm going to first discuss IFI policy space occupation as I see it. And then after that, I'll come to the gendered impacts of IFI policy space occupation, illustrated with case examples. So first, the background, which is IFI policy space occupation. IFIs use, and I think you heard this from Jomo and perhaps other of our speakers today, they use every tool and opportunity to squeeze developing and transition countries' policy space. And since 1980, the main tool has been conditionalities attached to loans. We've heard a lot about structural adjustment loans as being the main tool, but we also have to remember that World Bank and other multilateral development banks use every project loan possible to squeeze policy space too. I know firsthand from experience that agriculture, rural development, water supply, sanitation, education, health, and virtually every type of conventional development bank project also includes conditionalities, such as privatization of services, such as dropping tariffs unilaterally without developed country reciprocity. Also, the future wave that we've actually arrived at are replacing project loans. The IFIs are increasingly replacing project loans with sector-wide loans. And these will become new tools, I'm sure, for conditionalities that squeeze fiscal space. So I just want to underline that IFIs use every vehicle possible to constrain policy space. Over time, the IFIs have responded to persistent criticism, including protests on the streets, complaining that IFI policy conditionalities have harmful social, including gendered impacts. And a key response, and we already heard this, I believe, from Jomo, is that the IFIs have been quick to change the names of their instruments like SALs, and they even claim that they've eliminated or reduced the number of conditionalities and have stopped squeezing policy space. But very, very recent civil society research demonstrates that the IFIs have actually increased the number of policy conditionalities that decrease their policy space. In the press recently, you've seen a number of articles discussing recent IFI policy space issues that I want to talk about a little bit. Recently, the press has been discussing cancellation of cancellation of poor countries' debt. To become eligible for debt relief, countries must comply with IFI-imposed policy reforms. We need to look at two types of debt cancellation, those initiated by countries themselves and those resulting from cancellation by the IFIs and other creditors. Gender Action and many of its partners recently applauded the increasing series of IFI debt cancellations that we've been hearing about. Debt cancellation does free up policy space. It permits countries to choose policies that are not imposed by IFI loans and debt rescheduling. It enables countries to expand domestic policy space and to independently choose among various macroeconomic and development policy options. And it even might permit some countries to end their supervision by the Bretton Woods institutions. How so? Because debt relief frees up public resources that countries can use to repay their debt and for spending on government programs. So, first of all, we celebrate that a cascade of countries have been paying off their IMF debts and announcing the end of their ties to the IMF. Since 2003, some of the IFI's largest debtor countries have announced they would pay off their IMF debts ahead of schedule. These countries include Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, Serbia, and Uruguay. And several of these countries actually announced that this decision would liberate them from IMF domination of their policy space. They announced that they would no longer want or need IMF control of their policy space. Countries are fed up with IMF occupation of their policy space. These cancellations have placed the IMF in somewhat of a legitimacy and a relevancy crisis. The IMF budget is squeezed and it's searching for new ways to survive. That's the way it looks to civil society on the outside. The IMF is searching for a new mandate. Its supporters, the richest countries, are trying to reinvent the IMF. Taking advantage of this time of IMF crisis, hundreds of civil society groups around the world this year launched a campaign called the IMF Shrink or Sink It. Gender Action is a founding active member of this first concerted global campaign against the IMF, officially launched in September 2006 at the Bank Fund annual meetings around them. At the least, we feel that the IMF needs comprehensive reform, and if that fails, then it should close. We must eliminate, we feel, the IMF's gatekeeper function, a powerful role, which means its approval is required for developing countries to access bilateral or multilateral loans or grants. We must eliminate the IMF's power to impose conditions such as deregulation, privatization, public services reduction, and its overarching market fundamentalist paradigm that occupies national policy space. Our campaign elements include persuading southern and transitional governments to refuse to sign new loan agreements or enter into new programs with the IMF, conducting citizens' audits of the IMF's performance and impact, and urging parliaments and other official bodies to do likewise, and popularizing the option of withdrawing from the IMF altogether. We have alternative ideas about how to deal with global, regional, national financial crises. Second, so I talked about one group of countries that have voluntarily been repaying their IMF debts early and withdrawing from the IMF system. And then second, there's another group of countries, of poorer countries, that are receiving debt cancellation. That's really what we've been hearing most about in the press. And that's thanks to citizens' pressure on governments that are stuck with illegitimate IMF or IFI debt. This is IFI, larger than the IMF. 20 developing countries are already eligible for debt relief by bilateral and multilateral creditors, including the IMF, IDB, IDA of the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. And 9 additional countries are expected to become eligible very soon, and a further 11 should become eligible down the line. The debt cancellation in these countries is not total, but it's up to the end of 2003 or 2004 debt, depending on the IFI. And debt incurred after those dates does not qualify for cancellation. I will not delve into debt cancellation mechanisms and the decision points that trigger them. But I wanted to set this scene. As far as I know, and I think I got this information from 50 years, one country, Bolivia, among the poor countries receiving debt relief, has publicly announced its intention to break with the IMF policies as a result, along with debt cancellation. And Ghana recently announced that it would not renew its poverty reduction growth facility agreement with the IMF when it expires soon, although it's unclear whether Ghana will be able to wholly escape its relationship with the IMF. But its announcement should be applauded if it frees up its policy space. All countries want to regain control of their policy space and resources instead of allowing them to be subject to massive debt repayments to the big creditors, the World Bank, the IMF, and the other IFIs. So our campaign that I mentioned aims basically to disempower this control by the IMF. But meanwhile, while this debt cancellation is occurring, we feel that all countries must be on guard by attempts by the IMF and the World Bank to establish new measures and new instruments to retain their ability to determine countries' policies even after debt relief is implemented. Okay, I'm going to now move on to some gendered impacts. IMF policy-based loans, for example, tariff reductions that undermine the livelihood of farmers, affect women in particular who constitute the majority of the world's farmers in the world's poorest countries. That's just one example. In this part of my talk, I'm going to give many other examples of how IFI policies particularly harm women and their gendered impacts. So our starting point is that 70% of the world's poor are women at this point, and this is a UN piece of data. Gender Action and our partners' work demonstrates that not only have $1 trillion of IFI development loans not reduced poverty, but the assistance has often harmed women. IFI loans to developing countries impinging on country sovereignty. By requiring governments to reform economic, financial, and trade policies have had very negative impacts on women. The kinds of reforms we're talking about, as you know, are called conditionalities, loan conditionalities. They generally bypass local democratic processes and contribute to the feminization of poverty. Bhumika asked me specifically to address PRSPs, so I'd like to do so in the context of gender. Until very recently, until a year ago, Gender Action monitored PRSPs very closely for gender. We found that some PRSPs better address gender issues than others do. For any novices here, these are poverty reduction strategy papers required by both the World Bank and the IMF. They are really national development plans. The World Bank and the IMF call them country-owned, but they must be approved by the boards of directors of both the World Bank and the IMF, which really questions how country-owned they are. And I've visited so many countries and have never found one country that feels they're country-owned. So, Jomo, I just wanted to respond to your remark saying that the UN is no longer promoting poverty reduction strategies. However, I want to point out to you that I feel that your office or whomever at the UN you feel is no longer promoting them needs to transmit the message to other parts of the UN, because in the last month alone, both UNDP's Africa region and UNIFEM's, that's the United Nations Development Fund for Women's, Central CIS, Central Independent States, approached Gender Action asking us, would we help them integrate gender into PRSPs that they're working very hard to promote. I had to tell them that we no longer engage directly in PRSPs and offer instead that we would be happy to explain why we don't want to legitimize PRSPs. So I hope you get the message out. In 1999, for newcomers here, the IMF, somebody may have mentioned this, renamed its stabilization loans, previously known as Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facilities, to Poverty Reduction Growth Facilities. And the World Bank renamed its structural adjustment loans Poverty Reduction Support Credits to reflect their new emphasis on poverty reduction. At the same time, the two institutions jointly required that low-income governments prepare poverty reduction strategy papers, PRSPs, which is what we've been talking about. So we've already heard, and I just will reiterate, that PRSPs actually contain the same kinds of conditionalities as the many, many other facilities of the IMF and the World Bank that we've heard about today. And it's for that reason that we no longer want to legitimize them. Bhumika also asked me, would I please give country examples of how conditionalities, policy space, have impinged on gender issues, and particularly on women. So I'm going to give you 5 short examples in 5 different countries. The first one is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Gender Action, with partner organizations, is beginning a new project now to introduce the missing gender dimension into discussions about mining, revenues, and conflict, with a case study in the DRC. Many others have connected conflict, mining, and the impunity with which armed forces and groups perpetrate rape and sexual violence against hundreds of thousands of girls and women in the DRC. So what does this have to do with the IFIs? It has a lot to do with their conditionalities governing mining activities and revenues. The forced displacements, killing, sexual slavery and assaults, child labor and abuse of power for economic gain are directly linked to control of resource extraction and sale of mineral resources that have been dictated by conditionalities in IMF and World Bank loans. I'll come to those conditionalities, so you'll see what I mean in a minute. The major beneficiaries of these mining revenues are transnational corporations and local elites, as you would expect. IFI loan conditionalities include mine privatization and restructuring and providing guarantees for corporate investors. In each of these arenas, the IFI's neglect of the gender dimensions of their operations contribute to the tragic outcomes that I just mentioned for women. For example, the World Bank's MIGA, Multilateral International Investment Guarantee Agency, provides political risk insurance to private mining companies operating in the DRC. The World Bank's International Development Association, IDA, makes loans to the DRC to restructure the mining sector, including laying off tens of thousands of workers. And the IMF's Article 4 consultation requires the DRC to reform the mining sector through privatizing mines. These reinforcing policy conditionalities affect the economic livelihoods of women and girls who are tied up in dangerous mining activities, sometimes involving children as young as 7 years old. Their livelihoods are also undermined by the environmental destruction caused by this mining. For example, this destruction requires women walk further to find firewood, and in particularly women and girls facing a daunting array of needs for physical safety. IFI loans do not address any of these gendered outcomes of their loans. I don't think they make the connections in many cases. So that's one example. My second example is Malawi. For years, the bank and the fund have been forcing Malawi to privatize its state marketing board, known as ADMARC, as well as its strategic grain reserve, which are used to keep the price of maize affordable. Privatization of ADMARC and the strategic grain reserve have contributed to a food crisis in Malawi. Women are forced to wait during the night, in long lines at ADMARC to buy maize, risking attack on their way home from these lineups. And when they cannot buy maize, women must scavenge for leaves and for boiled tubers and roots to feed themselves and their families. Chronic hunger has also forced desperate Malawian women and girls into sex work and early marriage and increased their exposure to HIV/AIDS. The excess supply of sex workers has glutted the market. For our economists and others here, sex workers claim that prior to the food crisis, they could charge US $8 for unprotected sex and $1 to $2 for sex with a condom. Now the rates have plummeted to US 80 cents without a condom. Workers would rather die a little later from AIDS than die from hunger today. Third example of the impacts of IFI conditionalities on women. Mozambique. Mozambique's successive IMF poverty reduction growth facilities and World Bank poverty reduction support credits. These are totally policy-based loans. That's what they are. Mandated a new labor law which increases labor flexibility by reducing retrenchment costs, including severance pay, paying piece rates, making it easier for companies to downsize and use short-term labor, and make hiring contractual. And also, the IFIs required facilitating employment of foreign nationals. Last year, when I visited Mozambique, I kept lamenting that a country that has maintained an average per capita income growth rate of 10% a year for the last decade is so impoverished, with such extraordinarily high rates of illiteracy and HIV/AIDS, especially among females. You know, I kept saying to myself, how could it be that a country has a 10% growth rate on average for a decade and is so impoverished? Well, granted, the country had been in deep civil war for a while, but it's enjoyed a decade or more than a decade of high rate growth. The reason for this unexpected outcome is that a handful of transnational corporations run a few very highly capital-intensive export-related projects. These are not labor-intensive projects. They employ far too few Mozambicans, but they enrich a small elite as well as the transnational corporations, and do they ever lift that GDP on average? So, if any of you ever thought about trickle down, here is an example of how it doesn't work. This picture demonstrates that IFI policies and loans to support transnational corporations and elites and not the poor whom they claim to support. I'd like to use as my fourth example a transition country, and this is Serbia and Montenegro. They are now two independent republics, but when Gender Action did its work in Serbia and Montenegro a couple of years ago, the two republics were united. In Serbia and Montenegro, World Bank and IMF structural adjustment loans form the primary response to a devastating decade of civil war. After Serbia and Montenegro rejoined the World Bank in 2001, over 80, actually I calculated 85% of bank loans were adjustment loans initially in the first 3-4 years. That is changing now, but that was the case. This very high proportion of adjustment operations characterizes economic reforms in transition countries more broadly. Gender Action's analysis of loans in Serbia in 2003 show how these structural adjustment loans fail to acknowledge or to mitigate the harmful impacts on men and women. Here are a couple of examples. First, women comprise the majority of service sector workers providing finance, education, and health services in Serbia and Montenegro, as in so many other countries. They also comprise the majority of textile industry employees there. The World Bank private and financial sector adjustment credit required the governments to privatize the textile industry, smaller enterprises, as well as downsize the public sector without any regard for the gender impacts. And I told you women were the majority of workers in these sectors. So women's precarious position, economic position in these enterprises and government jobs made them especially vulnerable to layoffs. And of course, they constituted the majority of those newly unemployed, and also have become the majority, as elsewhere, of informal sector employees with very few assets to become self-employed. All of the World Bank loans said, oh, the laid off could just become self-employed. They could all open their own enterprises, but most felt they didn't have skills to do so, having lived in socialist economies for so long. A second example is the World Bank Serbia Social Sector Structural Adjustment Credit, which reforms pension, labor, and employment laws. It encourages self-employment again, but it fails to acknowledge the barriers that prevent women from succeeding in small businesses. Serbia's new labor law eliminates previously required collective bargaining, and it weakens labor's power. It diminishes protection from discrimination for women and other workers in weak positions in the labor market. Women lack the collateral to access loans, since men own most of the property. Women comprise a larger percentage of the unemployed, and they have been hurt most by these bank conditions. My fifth and final little case study is Tanzania. In 2003, the Tanzanian government, complying with World Bank and IMF loan requirements, sold the management of the Dar es Salaam Urban Water and Sewage Authority to City Water, a joint venture, a corporate joint venture between private companies based in Germany, Britain, and Tanzania. After City Water took off, tariffs increased. The price of water went up. Although women were primarily responsible for getting water in Tanzania, an ActionAid report, I'm looking at my ActionAid friend in the audience, an ActionAid report found that city water privatization scheme utterly neglected to consider household gender relations or the needs of women and girls in the reform. The primary benefits of high water prices were reaped by the corporation, City Water, and owners of private wells, while poor women and girls continued to have to walk very long distances carrying water for no pay. In fact, every single time I visit African countries, maybe you too, I am always stunned to see women and girls carrying water on their heads, barefoot on unpaved roads. And I always ask myself, how is it that the billions of dollars of IFI loans dedicated to water supply projects in Africa, as well as IFI transport projects in Africa, have not relieved the burden of women and girls carrying water on their head barefoot on unpaved roads? And it eliminates their opportunities to earn income and attend schools. I have interviewed so many women in Africa who've told me that if they didn't have to spend hours carrying water for hours, they could earn income in that time, or they could put their daughters in schools. So how could it be that the IFIs have not done that, and yet their conditionalities have made these conditions worse? Privatizing water monopolies has increased poverty. Women and girls deserve investments that will allow them to earn income and go to school. So the bottom line of the story is that in 2005, last year, the government of Tanzania was forced to cancel its contract with City Water due to citizens' pressure. People were just fed up. For more reading, those are my 5 examples. For more reading on how IMFI policy space occupation has harmed women and girls, I highly recommend ActionAid International's publications on how IMF policies crimp government spending on combating HIV/AIDS. Rick Rowden, the author of that great report, is sitting right here in the middle of the audience. ActionAid International's publications have shown how governments cannot spend on combating HIV/AIDS, on keeping girls in school, and how IMF policies have made it impossible for countries to reach the Millennium Development Goals. I would like to end shortly by asking why policy conditionalities are so persistent. Why are they so sticky? Why do IFIs do everything to camouflage the continuation of conditionalities? They morph them into different names, different facilities. Our case study examples demonstrate that a key reason is that IFI conditionalities open up developing country markets to transnational corporations. In IFI loan after loan, the main beneficiaries have been transnational corporations that win IFI contracts not the poor whom the IFIs claim are the beneficiaries. If the poor were the beneficiaries, then the $100 billion that IFIs disperse annually would have made a huge dent in poverty. Poverty would have been seriously reduced. That has not happened. The nature of policy prescriptions that benefit transnational corporations and the global north explains why the policy space crusade has been central to the IFIs. The IFIs serve these powers that I mentioned that be. And let me say that many gender action partners, civil society organizations, are working to change the governing structure of the IFI so that they better reflect borrower interests. And some of those groups are here today also. So finally, please let me conclude by saying that little changes significantly when it comes to the IFIs. In 1989, I was a member of a World Bank task force that laid the groundwork for the 1990 World Development Report on Poverty. We concluded that poverty can only be reduced by asset and income redistribution. Income distribution has worsened in most countries since then. A major reason for worsening income distribution and deeper poverty are IFI policies and loans that cater to multinational corporations and elites, not to the poor whom they claim to serve. Thank you.
We're going to hear from Mark Allen next.
Thank you very much. If Elaine congratulated those of you who are still here, I think I'm even more at your mercy for being here another 20 minutes later. Sorry? Could you lift the microphone up a bit? Isn't that a bit dangerous? Is anything going to fall off? Right, let's see. All right, okay. It doesn't. I think I have to have my feet amputated or something. All right, okay. Is that better? Okay. There have been a large number of things to comment on, but let me run through a few observations of my own, which are very much related to points that have come up. One is, to start with, about the whole link between global imbalances and new policy space in developing countries. We've seen a very interesting period in the world in the last 6 years. It's been about the fastest period of world growth that in a generation or more. And it's not one which has been limited actually to to Asia, but we also see it in most continents and in most countries. In fact, we see faster growth in Africa in the last 5 years than we have for a long time. Now, why is this? Why has this occurred? Well, some of us in the business like to flatter ourselves that it's better policies, that policymakers in countries are actually doing a lot better. There may be truth in that. But obviously one of the things that's really pushing this is the response of the world to the 2001 recession, particularly what's happened in this country, in the United States. There's been a sharp decline in US savings rates, a US fiscal expansion in response to the 2001 recession. And as a result, there's been a huge and sustained contribution coming out of the United States to world demand. And this has led to a really quite an extraordinary liquidity situation, a world boom, a commodity price boom, which has made it very hard, actually, for countries not to run surpluses. With the US providing such a large deficit in the world, then it's very hard for other countries, actually, to run deficits themselves. So what we're seeing is most countries are in a situation where they can build up quite large foreign exchange reserves. This is in part to protect themselves. It's part, as they say, to stay out of the clutches of the IMF. But it's also because they've been following a set of policies, which, as Heiner Flassbeck said, to run undervalued exchange rates so as to take continued advantage of this boom. Now, I have to say, this has put the IMF out of business for a bit. a lot of countries have paid the fund back. This is actually quite what you'd expect at a time when IMF money is relatively expensive and liquidity conditions in markets are really extraordinarily easy. It would be quite silly for these countries not to pay the fund back, even if they didn't want to get the extra policy space that may be involved in having a relationship with the fund. And then, as we've said, as in the highly indebted poor countries, we've been through a series of debt reduction operations, as Elaine pointed out. Most recently, the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, which already something like 22 countries have benefited from. Just one correction, that the IDB does not give, is not part of this initiative. No one has found the money yet for the IDB to finance its part. This particular cancellation of debt only applies to the IMF, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. So nothing in Asia, nothing in Europe, or nothing from the Inter-American Bank yet on that. These countries now do have more policy space. This is true both of the emerging markets and it's true of of Africa. And the challenge is obviously to ensure that this space is well used and that these countries do not become vulnerable to a downturn in the world economy and a drying up of these very favourable liquidity situations. Now, is the current situation stable? Well, have we actually now definitively resolved the problem of emerging market financial crisis?